In our last 3 episodes, we focused on fairies and fae folk, as well as some other strange events that are taking place throughout forests around the world. But on today's show, we're taking a step back to once again bring you 4 more listener stories. From strange lights in the sky to doppelgangers and dark entities, tonight's tales are sure to leave you questioning your reality. So please, sit back and join me as we listen to what these 4 eyewitnesses have to say.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground, which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision, I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7-8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
Welcome to the Paranormal Mysteries podcast, and thank you for being here. I am your host, Nick Ryan. I'd like to start the show by saying thank you to our listeners and, of course, our supporters on Patreon. I'd also like to welcome our newest patron, Casey. Your support and generosity is amazing, and it makes our podcast possible. For a full list of our wonderful supporters, please see the show notes. Tonight's first listener story comes to us from Micah. Micah's story is called Friday Night Lights. Micah says, "Hi Nick. So I've been a fan for quite some time, but never had an experience good enough to write about. My girlfriend, on the other hand, attracts the paranormal like a magnet. I had her write this down for you and the audience to hear. This whole encounter happened about 7 years ago, when I was still in high school. For clarity's sake, I'll refer to my friend as A, her boyfriend as C, and my boyfriend at the time as D. My friend and I dated these 2 guys that were part of the drama club at our high school. It was a cool Friday night in the beginning of fall. Since living in Southern California can get to be so hot during the summertime, we didn't want to be indoors on a night like this. We knew our boyfriends were having a play rehearsal for their show that began within the following week. Since it was so close to the opening night, they were expected to stay till 10 p.m., if not later. Our urge to be out into the night won, and we decided to go visit them while they were taking a short half-hour break. When A and I got to the school, we realized that there were people everywhere. These large groups of people were scattered throughout the grounds, pretty much surrounding the entire school. There were people in the parking lot, some walking towards the school from their parked cars down the street, just everywhere. We had completely forgotten about the varsity football game that was happening. It was a big game for the school, but we just weren't fans of our school's football team, so we didn't care to go to the actual game. We grabbed our boyfriends from the parking lot, drove out of the school, and up the road a little bit. We ended up finding a spot far enough away that the screaming fans weren't too loud, but close enough to be well within walking distance back to the school. We parked, rolled down the windows, and enjoyed the nice fall breeze. About 15 minutes after parking, I began to notice these lights in the sky. Everyone else in the car was chatting away, but I was fixated on these lights. There were hundreds of them, and they seemed to have all appeared in a split second. 1 minute they weren't there, and then suddenly they were. I can't begin to describe how I felt. Almost overwhelmed. There wasn't any particular reason to feel this way, but I couldn't help it. My friend had then grabbed my attention by calling out my name. My head whipped around in her direction, and I asked, "Do you see those lights?" My friend and our boyfriends all stuck their heads out of the window and said nothing. I had this sudden urge to get out of the car, so I got out and on top of the car to watch the lights. Now these lights were strange. They were a bright blue in color, almost fluorescent. This ruled out any type of aircraft, since they also weren't blinking, just a solid fluorescent blue. The way they moved in the sky was not in any fashion I've ever seen before. It couldn't be a plane or a helicopter, and with the way these lights were gliding across the night sky, it would be impossible for there to be that many aircraft flying so close together. At this point, I began to realize that there were other people walking past us to go to the game, and not a single person noticed. Here the four of us were, gawking at the night sky, and not a single person was looking to see why. My boyfriend jokingly said, "Maybe it's parachuters." For context, the area that we live has an incredibly popular spot to skydive. It's world famous, actually, so he wouldn't have been wrong. Then again, I've never heard of this skydiving company doing night jumps, nor did these lights move across the sky like parachuters. If people were doing a nighttime sky jump, the lights would have been moving down and towards the ground, but these lights were moving all together across the sky, very slowly, never breaking formation. We all sat there for a good 5 minutes, staring at this phenomenon, and then the lights just all turned off. They were gone with no trace of where they could have disappeared to. C and D got back in the car like nothing had happened, but my friend and I were absolutely freaked out. Not long after that, A and I dropped the boys back off at the school, while we began heading back home to our house. Of course, we couldn't stop talking about it. We were so worked up that we even began talking about the end of the world. We knew we sounded insane, but we felt awful because of how we seemed to be the only people who noticed those lights. Not even our boyfriends seemed to really care. They sort of acted as if you see those types of lights move across the sky like that all the time. By the time we got back home to her house, we were freaked out, but we knew it was probably nothing serious. A few minutes after we sat down to eat dinner, her mom had also sat down with us in the kitchen to hear about our night. We began to retell this story to her when we suddenly heard a light knock at the door. By this time, it was close to 9:45 at night. No one they knew was coming over for the night, nor was it usual to hear someone knocking at their door that late. We all looked at each other in confusion, so I jumped up to go see who it was. My friend whispered out to me not to open the door, so I just looked through the peephole. That's when I saw an old man. This old man seemed normal, but off at the same time. He had on a white shirt, blue jeans, sneakers, and was holding a fluorescent blue flashlight in his hand. The weirdest part was his face. It seemed like he had a large head, but didn't. His eyes, on the other hand, were the scariest of all. The best way to describe them was that they were sunken in. No distinguishable eye color or shape, honestly, just sunken in and dark. On top of that, I realized that he wasn't looking straight ahead at the door. He, instead, was staring at the bottom of the door. No emotions, no blinking, just staring. I took this all in within a few seconds and kind of jumped away from the door. At this point, my friend's stepmom was halfway down the stairs, asking who it was. By the looks on my face, she knew it wasn't any friend. I whispered, "I don't know. It's some old guy." She looked confused. An old guy? What the heck does some old man want at this time? She threw open the door and was met with silence. At this point, I started slowly walking backwards into the kitchen. She came in 15 seconds later saying, "Are you sure you saw someone?" There was no one out there. I was shocked. Why was such a small question so terrifying? I just nodded my head, and she hurried up and locked the door behind her. She looked at her wife and said, "I went to the end of the driveway and looked around. There was nobody out there." Mind you, from the time I had looked through the peephole to the time she opened the door was under a minute. If someone was there, they wouldn't have gotten very far. The silence in the house became absolutely deafening. A's stepmom went back upstairs, just as confused as we were, while her mom asked us not to leave the house for the night. We were planning on going over to C's house to watch movies, but at that point, her mom was not wanting us to leave at all. My friend talked to her mom more, while I sort of checked out. I couldn't stop thinking about this old man, and how he had a flashlight, exactly like the color of the lights in the sky, or how he could have run away from sight in under a minute. A talked her mom into reluctantly letting us go, but said to keep an eye out and be smart. She walked us to the door and watched us get into the car. As soon as she heard the car start, she went back inside. At this point, my friend and I are freaked out beyond a doubt. We couldn't shake this feeling of being watched, even though there was no one around. As we sat in A's car, beginning to pick a song for our short drive, the center hub light in her car suddenly turned on. I stared at her, and she stared straight ahead with wide eyes. As we're silently staring, A says, that's really, really weird. I paused and then asked why. A then responded with, well, I've had this car for over a year, and that light has never worked before. Without looking, she reached her hand down to the switch and tried turning it off, but it didn't work. I realized her eyes were even wider than before as she says, it was off, meaning that the light that's never worked before turned on in the off position. She tried switching it back off again, which worked the second time, but then tried to turn the light back on. It suddenly wouldn't work anymore. At that point, we were truly frightened. We drove in absolute silence and fear. By the time we got to C's house, we had sprinted inside and locked the door behind us. When we began telling C and D what else happened, even they were a little sketched out. None of us could explain what was happening, and none of us wanted to think further into it. I just kept thinking, aliens, aliens, aliens. My friend and I were too freaked out to leave, so we just stayed at his house for the night. Somewhere in the middle of the movie we were watching, I had fallen asleep. I don't remember doing so, but I was suddenly woken up to a bright flash. I couldn't tell if it was from my dream or if someone turned on a light, but I was suddenly wide awake in the middle of the night. I stumbled around for my phone, but couldn't find it. I realized in that moment my face was really warm. I lifted my hands to feel my cheeks, trying to figure out whether I had a temperature or just got hot in the middle of the night. Instead, my hands felt wet. I woke up my boyfriend by shaking him, and although it was dark, the light from the moon was shining through the windows. He looked directly at me, and after a long pause, he said, "Are you okay?" Without thinking, I responded with, "I don't know, my face is wet." He kind of shuffled around and grabbed his phone. As soon as he flashed his phone light on me, he dropped his phone and yanked me from my spot. He started freaking out and rushing me to the bathroom. When he turned on the light, I understood why. I had blood pouring out of my nose. It was everywhere, smeared all over my face and shirt. At this point, he's pounding on C's bedroom door, yelling for A to wake up. She bolted out, saw me, and froze. The four of us all just looking at each other. A then ran into the bathroom and slammed the door. We never spoke about what we were looking at. She just gave me a towel so I could shower. She never left my side. When I was done and had put tissue paper up my nose to stop the bleeding, we walked out to see all the lights on in the house. Our boyfriends were just standing there near the couch. At this point, I'm thinking, great. There's blood all over the couch. How are we going to clean it up? It's probably everywhere. This is really embarrassing. But once we walked over there, I realized the couch was perfectly clean. No blood at all. The four of us never went back to sleep that night. We just stayed up watching movies. My boyfriend could hardly take his eyes off of me, and I don't blame him. At that point, we all knew what must have happened, but were too freaked out to say the actual words. Needless to say, I'll never forget those Friday night lights and the events that happened afterwards. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear any of my other paranormal stories, I'd love to write them out for you all to hear. Our next story of the night comes from Juan. Juan's story is called The Cold Room. Juan says, "Hello, Nick. I have been listening to your podcast for a while, and I'm a big fan. Growing up, I had a few experiences that shook me, but I always looked back at them as the active imagination of a child. It wasn't until I was much older that I questioned if they did in fact happen, due to a few experiences that I had in my 20s. During that time, I lived in a house that never felt like a home. It's hard to explain, but I was never at ease. I slept in a bedroom downstairs, and it was the only room in the house that would never warm up. I chalked it up to the heating system, even though it seemed to work just fine around the house. I didn't mind it, because I've always liked a cold room on account that I run a bit hot. I don't remember how things began, but they seem to have escalated as time went by. If I remember correctly, it all began with nightmares. Mind you, I've never really been the type to have good, happy dreams. Even though I rarely dream, they always seem dark and sinister. I remember having nightmares that would keep me in a state of panic for hours after waking up, but this particular one seems to stand out for some reason. The house was located on a busy intersection where you would see accidents on a regular basis, so take it as you will. That night, I remember waking up and feeling this sense of dread. I then went outside and saw that there was a blizzard coming down. I realized right at that moment I was dreaming. It was in the middle of summer after all. However, I kept waking up several times, and every time it would be a darker version of the dream I had just had. The next one would be cars crashing into each other, then police and ambulances crashing all over the place, finishing with cops ransacking the cars of the people involved in the accidents. I had a lot of dark dreams in that room, but that one really stood out. Then the experiences began. They started simple at first. One night while my sister and I were talking in my room, suddenly she got up to leave when the light fixture fell on the bed, right where she was sitting. I also had lamps blow out and then work just fine when I checked them. After a while, things got darker. We are immigrants. I was, and still am, used to sleeping on the edge of my bed, because I used to sleep on a couch or the floor growing up until I had my own room. So even though at this time I had a gigantic bed, I still slept on the edge. One night as I was sleeping, I felt someone sit on the edge of my bed. I woke up and looked around, but there was nothing there. That happened a few more times, but I thought it was just in my head. Until one night, I felt someone sit down again. This time, I was ready. As soon as I felt someone sit, I instinctively reached out to grab whatever I could, and I did. I grabbed what I can only describe as a photo, like a Polaroid. I know it's strange, but bear with me. I quickly reached out and grabbed it. Then it started pulling away slowly, the way you would do it if you didn't want to wake someone up. As I held onto it tighter and tighter, it finally jerked away, leaving me finally awake and confused. The second time I was facing down, sleeping, when I suddenly felt someone sit down again and slowly start pushing down on the back of my neck, harder and harder as the seconds went by. I was paralyzed. Not by fear, but because I was furious. No one was going to mess with me as I slept. When I finally mustered the courage and strength to turn around and say, "Leave me alone," it went away, whatever it was. The third time it happened, it went the same way. I felt someone sit, and again I grabbed at something. This time, I grabbed at what I can only describe as a button from a woman's dress. You know, the dresses with the buttons covered in the same fabric from the dress. This time, I did the same thing. I reacted quickly and grabbed the button, but like the last time, I was afraid to open my eyes right away. The person, or whatever it was, started pulling away slowly, just like the last time, until I got a good grip on it, and it finally jerked away. What I saw next gave me chills, and I'm still trying to figure it out. Now, I've told these experiences to a few people, either my family or a couple of friends over some drinks, when conversation takes a paranormal direction. But I've never told anyone this particular detail, and it's the reason I'm finally sending you my story. A few days ago, I was catching up with your podcast when suddenly you mentioned the doppelganger effect. It sent chills down my spine. The one detail I've left out from that night when I tell the button story is that as soon as it jerked away, I took a good look at what was near my bed. It was the image of my mother. For a long time, I tried to chalk it up to a lack of sleep during those times, but I know what I saw. It was my mom, slowly fading away into the corner of the room, but she had a very sad look on her face. The thing is, my mom was sleeping soundly upstairs. I don't want to make this too long, so I'll just tell you the last experience I had at that place. I was in bed sleeping when suddenly I felt a very strong wind come from above, followed by a white light. It was odd, because even though I had my eyes closed, I could tell that the light was white, but not blinding, and the wind was cool, not cold. I could hear the flapping of what sounded like pigeon wings, but they seemed gigantic, and they were flapping surprisingly fast for their size. It almost sounded like a helicopter. As I felt that, I wasn't exactly scared, but I was nervous. I didn't know what to make of it. I finally mustered the courage to open my eyes and looked up, only to have everything fade away, like a hole closing up in the ceiling. For years, I never thought these stories meant anything more than an exhausted mind, until a couple of months ago, when I saw my cousin that used to live there and sleep in that room. When I told her about my experiences, she told me of dark shadows that appeared to her and something that would pull down her blanket and run its hand down her back at night. That gave me chills. I've never really believed in the paranormal. I like the paranormal as entertainment, and I've always attributed my childhood experiences to just having an active imagination. But nothing like this has happened to me since I left that place. So take it as you will. Thank you for considering my story. Our next story of the night comes from Philip. Philip's story is called Shadow Figure on the Crossroad. Philip says, "Hi, Nick. I came across your podcast a few days ago during this quarantine, and I can say I'm loving it since day one. I've always been skeptical about ghosts, perhaps because I've never witnessed something unusual, even though I grew up with relatives telling me all sorts of things regarding the paranormal. But the episodes starring the Shadow People and the Hat Man reminded me of something that occurred with my brother. The story I'm about to tell you happened to him in 2011. Since I didn't ask his permission to submit this, we'll call him Luke. He's even more of a skeptic than me, as you're about to notice during this story. Me, Luke, and our family lived on a wooded countryside in a city, which happened to be a hotbed for paranormal activity, from UFOs to ghosts, southeast of Brazil. On this day, his ex-girlfriend, who lived in the same neighborhood, asked him to go with her to pick up some clothes at her place about a mile from our house, so they did. They left my house around 6:30 to 7 p.m. on foot, and as they were walking down a street with no public illumination, they saw someone standing on their path on a crossroad. My brother didn't think it was something abnormal, so he greeted the dark silhouette of a man, but it didn't reply, so he greeted it again, yet no feedback. A quick note, in some regions of Brazil, especially the countryside, it is considered impolite to not greet someone back. My brother got a little upset, but at the same time he got mad, and then he walked toward the thing and said, "I'm talking to you, buddy." As he approached, his girlfriend started to feel something odd, kind of like a bad feeling, and said, "Leave it, Luke. Let's get the hell out of here." He insisted and got closer, real close, and started to stare at the thing. It was dark, like those mentioned on earlier episodes, but it didn't have a nose, mouth, or even red eyes, just pitch black. At this point of this story, I think he was naive about the thing and didn't realize he was dealing with someone or something out of this world. Later he said that his behavior was way beyond stupid. Then his girlfriend freaked out, started to cry, and yelled at him, "Screw this, I'm leaving." As she started to run, he came to his senses and left the weird thing there, standing on a dark crossroad in the middle of nowhere. When they got back, my mother felt that something had happened, but none of them said what. It took some time, I think a month, to get him to talk about that shadow figure. Well, my guess is my brother snapped, and something drew him to get closer to that weird thing. Or he's just stupid. Either way, I can't believe it when he says he still considers himself a skeptic. I think he's just too scared to admit it, and that's the way he copes with this. It's funny, because after this, I started getting serious doubts about the paranormal. P.S. Some African religions are very popular in Brazil, and some of their rituals are performed on crossroads. So in popular culture, crossroads, at least here, are considered an area of transit for spirits, either good or bad. Thanks for the opportunity to tell this story. Keep up the great work with your podcast. Best regards from Brazil. Philip. Our last story of tonight comes to us from Alyssa. Alyssa's story is called Sleep Paralysis Demon. Alyssa says, "Hi, Nick. I came across your podcast about a week ago, and have been intrigued ever since. This past week I've had some pretty interesting sleep paralysis experiences that I would like to share, and truthfully would like a second opinion, because I don't think these were just dreams. I apologize for the length. Last Wednesday, I dreamt that my younger sister came to surprise visit me to help me move upstairs to my new apartment. I'll be moving upstairs in my building at the end of next week. The dream started out pretty normal, until the scene changed to me lying in my bed in the dark. I saw the silhouette of my sister come open and close the door. She jumped on top of me and started holding me down while taunting me. I tried to move but couldn't, and felt like I was literally being held down. While I was paralyzed, I kept hearing voices in my room as I tried to wake up. When I finally did wake up, I could move again. I fell back to sleep within 5 minutes and saw another very long, thin, hooded, shadowy figure on the ceiling of my room, and again, I couldn't move. When I actually woke up, I realized that shadow was not actually there. Fast forward to 2 nights later, I dreamt that I was in a bedroom with my sister, who looked like she was about 11 or 12. She's actually turning 26 in a few weeks. She was sitting on the bed, and we were just talking about normal stuff, but then one of her sentences didn't make any sense to what we were talking about. I stood over the bed and looked at her, and could see that she had very abnormally dark circles under her eyes. I looked into her eyes and noticed that her pupils were starting to turn a dark red. She gave me a sinister smile and let out a cackling laugh. I quickly grabbed my rosary beads that were on the nightstand and held them up to her, but noticed she too was holding a set. I jumped on the bed with my rosary beads and laid down on my right side to try to sleep. She suddenly jumped on top of me, putting her right hand on my upper back, and whispered in my ears something along the lines of, "So does Dad know I'm protecting you?" I really have no idea what that meant. Her whisper started getting deeper and deeper. I tried to scream, but nothing came out, only a mini screech, and I could not move my body. When I finally did wake up, my mouth was dry, and I continued to feel her hand on my back. I had a cold chill and could not shake the feeling of the hand on my back for a good hour, no matter how many times I tossed and turned and stayed wide awake. I made a connection to a paranormal experience I had when I was a teen. When I was about 15 and my sister was 12, she was out at a friend's house one night. It was around 11:40 at night, and my mother was half asleep in her room. I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth, and my dad was waiting for her to come home in my room. We suddenly heard the front door open and close, and my sister yell up, "I'm home!" My dad ran downstairs to greet her, only to find her not there in any of the rooms. She called 5 minutes later to say that her friend would give her a ride back home shortly. To this day, my mother, father, or myself cannot explain how or why this happened. I did have other encounters with that same spirit imitating my sister's voice that I would be happy to share, along with several other paranormal encounters and prophetic dreams. I honestly never believed that the ghost in my old house was evil, just a trickster, but for the first time, I felt that this one in my recent dreams was definitely evil. If you have any opinions or thoughts on what this might be, I would greatly appreciate any input or guidance. If you do read my story on your podcast, thank you in advance. Wishing you much success and to stay well. Alyssa. As we come to the end of tonight's episode, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for tuning in and supporting the podcast. If any of you have thoughts, advice, or a similar experience that you'd like to share with one of tonight's eyewitnesses, you can email me and I'll be sure to forward your message on to them. Until next time, I hope all of you have a safe and healthy week, and I'd like to say thank you to Micah, Juan, Philip, and Alyssa for writing in and sharing their experiences with all of us. If you or someone that you know has witnessed something unexplainable and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. Please remember, no matter how insignificant or outlandish you believe your experience may seem, I'd like to hear about it. You can also connect with us by joining our forum and by following us on social media. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, be sure to subscribe to the show and share it with your friends. If you're interested in taking the next step and becoming a patron, you can visit patreon.com/paranormal mysteries. Benefits include ad-free episodes and early access to select shows. New episodes of the Paranormal Mysteries podcast are produced every Sunday, with a new midweek mysteries airing every Wednesday, and they're available on all of your favorite podcast apps. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries podcast, thank you so much for listening, and remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.